So thank you for coming. So today's colloquium session features Ellen Lust, who is in the political science department at Yale and who is a Straus fellow at NYU this year, and the whole Straus gang is here, which is terrific. And the title of her talk is "Election Laws, Social Ties, and Political Representation in the Arab World." So as is our practice, Ellen will speak for about 10 or 15 minutes. I'll open up with the first question, and we'll take it from there. Okay, and today's session runs till about 4 o'clock.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you all for coming, especially those of you who are putting up with me for a second day in a row, which is amazing. Yeah. I want to talk about politics and sort of I'm going to focus the discussion on electoral laws and sort of the manipulation or the use of them. But I also want to start out by sort of a brief thinking about what I think is happening in the politics of elections, because I think that helps to inform what happens during the negotiations over electoral laws and then sort of the impact that these laws have. So I think a lot of times we have in the back of our minds sort of models of kind of individualistic voting, right? So an individual goes to the ballot box, casts a ballot for one of the candidates, and it's sort of a one-to-one relationship. That's the kind of the basic voting model that we have in the back of our minds when we look at elections. And I think that there's some problems with sort of transferring that to the Arab world. Actually, I think there's some problems with having that as the voting model, even if you're talking about the states. But that nevertheless is the one that we tend to work with. And certainly in areas where communal sort of identities and sort of communal obligations are very important and very strong, I think it tends to miss a lot of what's happening when elections are taking place. And then I also think it tends to miss a lot of the sort of the preferences and expectations over elections when we're thinking about something like electoral laws. So the reason for stepping back then to think about, first of all, what's happening on the social level. And then the second thing I think we have to realize is that when we're talking about transitioning cases, we're talking about places where a lot of the citizens' expectations, even as they go into new elections after breakdowns of regimes, are being sort of informed by what they thought elections were doing in the previous period, right? And so we also have to think about what did elections mean under authoritarian politics in order to think about what are people going to the polls and doing. So taking those two points. One is that if we think about simply what were elections over, right? They were rarely, if ever, really over policy, and particularly in the Arab world. I mean, there may be places where people thought that they were kind of really opening, but if you look at what did people think, did they think that they were going to the polls in order to, make policies that would change, economic policy, foreign policy, kind of the major, sort of social and political issues on the table? They didn't have any illusion that they were doing that. So if you ask people, what was the strength of the parliament? They'll tell you it was very weak. If you ask them with specific regards to different issue areas, they'll tend to tell you that they didn't think that it had any influence. The one place where they think it did have some influence, or the one group of people that thought it had some influence, tend to be those who were kind of the upper class, the elites. Very interesting in a sense, right? That they tended to, but even there, they tended to see it that way. But even there, it's actually very, very low. So people instead thought that what the representative could do for them, if they, essentially if they were lucky, was that the representative could help them to access resources, right? And so we're talking about regimes where transparency tends to be very low, rule of law tends to be very low. So the idea of getting your child into the right school, getting your grandmother into the hospital when she's sick, and all of these things really take a lot of work, and a lot of work meaning somebody who can help to call up the right person to make sure that these things can be done. And so what people started to think of the representative as was somebody who could serve them, right? And they got the name sort of, service parliamentarians, and they started to be seen as the person who could help you out. Not that they weren't the only person who could help you out. It didn't have to be that there was a parliamentarian who could do it, but nevertheless, one way that you could get help was to be going to a representative. This is where the social part of it comes in, right? Because you didn't necessarily think that here you can think, okay, who's my representative for my district? You call them up and you have a sort of a general expectation that they're going to be interested in helping you, and maybe as interested in helping you if they know you, whereas if they don't. But certainly in the region, there's a large expectation that people will help you if they know you, right? So you have to have some kind of a sort of a common identity, right? It can be that we're from the same village, we're from the same town, the same neighborhood. Better if I happen to be your, I happen to be your aunt, and so you can come and say, hey, auntie, can't you help me do this? And I feel incredibly obligated, right, to help you out and to make sure that you get the things you need. So that means that there becomes this big stress since the one thing that Parliament can do is to get you these resources, right? And the one person who's more likely to help you get those resources is the person who you somehow have some connection to versus the one that you don't. There becomes a very sort of strong relationship between being interested in voting somebody because they're in your social network, right? So that starts to become one of the pushes, and in fact, I would argue that sort of turns around what we think about as one of the kind of the problems with commitment problems, right? Is how do I know that if I sort of am out there, I'm going to do something for you, that you're going to vote for me, right? In this case, I vote for you because I know that you're the one person out of the 10 people who are running for the seat, and it usually is about 10 to 1. You're the one person who, if you get elected, you can actually help me, or you'd be willing to help me, right? So that's I would argue that that's the kind of the mindset a lot of people went into elections in the past with. It had a couple of sort of important implications. It meant, first of all, that people didn't care very much about political parties, right? And cared even less about them. And there's a variation, we haven't discussed, a variation in sizes of networks, density of networks, the extent to which these networks are strong or weak in different areas. So you can get, as a general rule, but not exclusively, urban areas tend to have weaker networks than rural areas. Some areas tend to have very large and almost sort of formalized, we think of these as tribes, but kind of communal efforts. Other places tend to be much more atomistic. So there's a variation both across countries and also within countries across regions that matters. But it meant that when we looked at, the sort of the institutional development underneath the authoritarian regimes, political parties tended to not to really mean much, right? And they even, I would argue, tended not to mean much in cases where you had ruling parties. So we tend to think, the NDP in Egypt, or the Ba'ath Party in Syria, or the RCD in Tunisia were somehow very meaningful as parties, but the reality is they tended to be very weak as parties, and are probably almost better off thought as sort of elite networks where what you had done was demonstrate an allegiance to a relative allegiance to the regime. So that was the first implication was that political parties didn't mean much, and of course it was also sort of exacerbated by the fact that if you didn't think you were really voting for policies, right? And we tend to think of party labels as being sort of a bundle of policies that go with them. You didn't think you were voting on policies, and you didn't really need to know much about which party a person belonged to. And in fact, when people did belong to parties, or when parties did exist, they tended to be known more as the person's name. So you didn't think of this as being X party that meant, this set of left or right policies. You tended instead to think of this party, oh, that's, Flan and Flan's party, right? This is, Majali's party, this is so-and-so's party. So they actually became almost personalized as what they meant. They meant they were a network that belonged or was connected to certain individuals. The second thing, of course, was that this also had an impact on sort of the sort of preferences over elections, and in terms of both of PR versus plurality or majoritarian rules, in terms of districting questions, right? So, if you were from a large tribe, for example, in Jordan, then you would have a very strong interest in making sure that the boundaries of your district roughly matched your tribe, right? And you would be very interested in making sure that these were sort of, ideally for you, plurality rules. SMTV, even in multi-member districts, would be the best rules. So there was a kind of a relationship then that even existed under the authoritarian period about the preferences over institutional rules and the development itself. Now, so what does this mean for transition periods, right? Which is, of course, what you're all like, this is nice, but what's the point? What it means, I think, is, first of all, that we still actually have to pay attention to the social structures and to the fact that these haven't disappeared, okay? And in fact, I think one of the things that's very striking is there certainly are changes. If you ask people, do you think the parliament will be able to do something important? And this is, for example, in the Egyptian survey before, in December 2011, we're finding that, a great number of people thought the Parliament was going to have either a great deal of influence or a lot of influence in the upcoming period. Of course, Parliament that is disbanded, right? But that was the expectation. So as people are going to the polls, they think now Parliament can do something, right? And this is exactly the same survey that showed people before thought it couldn't do anything. Similarly, so citizens think it can do something. Elites all of a sudden know that they can enter when they couldn't before. And there's this resurgence of energy about what elections mean. And also you see this as people actually go to the polls, right? I mean, much higher turnout in the transitional elections than before. But what we also see, though, is that despite that, a lot of people still want essentially the same things from their parliamentarian, right? They work for their representative. They still think that the representative is the person they're going to need to be able to turn to help. They still think that the person who they should be able to turn to sort of be most likely to get help from is the person who they somehow know and is in their network. In a sense, what's happened is that you've had an expansion of the networks, right? You've had a real sense in which it used to be that you wanted somebody you knew, but you also wanted somebody who was in good enough relations with the regime that they would do something for them. All of a sudden, there's a lot of uncertainty about who it is who's going to actually sort of be pulling those strings. So from a voter's perspective, there's a lot more people out there who could be a viable candidate. And from the elite's perspective, they're a lot more likely to be able to enter. But what they think is going to be the relationship between their relationship to an individual candidate and their willingness to vote for them actually doesn't change as much as we might expect it to. And so what we see then, right, is that, from elites, you still get the same sets of preferences over districting and electoral rules, right? We find, of course, that people coming back who don't, either returnees, and this is, for example, in the Libyan case, who came back from exile, know that they don't have strong social networks, but are very interested in parties' preferred PR sort of rules. Those who were from areas where they knew that they still had very strong social networks, preferred to have sort of majoritarian or plurality rules. So those kinds of preferences still map roughly the way that they did earlier. One of the big differences is the fact that you get a lot more people sort of around the table negotiating this, right? And so now you get, I think the most extreme case is the Libyan case, where you get just a sort of a electoral rule that's trying to appease everybody. I would argue that very possibly, and then may actually really sort of appeal to nobody, right? Because essentially you end up with, it's something like 80 PR seats with closed lists. You get 120, some of which are single member districts, some of which are plurality, multiple member districts. But you get this real kind of hodgepodge, and you get different areas of the country being, the extreme all single member districts, and then other sets of mixes, right? I mean, interesting, right? Certainly difficult if you looked at that being the rule that continues in terms of things like, party elites trying to coordinate or party strengthening. I mean, it has some real implications for that. But so that's I still think that there's this mapping, and we have to understand that mapping comes both from expectations that were set under the authoritarian period about what these parliaments can do, as well as from the sort of social expectations that underline what is really in some ways kind of a more communal way of thinking about relationships than we might have in the back of our minds. We can talk a little bit about what I think are some of the policy implications, right? So one of them is this argument I have in the Brookings paper that I think is particularly difficult, more difficult than we often give it credit to really having an expectation about what these rules will do. But also, I think, we have a tension between having what we think from a legal perspective, from a sort of institutional perspective as the ideal set of rules that could be negotiated, and from a political perspective of making sure that the process doesn't break down in the middle of being a process. And so, trying to keep members on board, trying to keep the elites relatively happy, and I would argue that that's the reason why you get an electoral rule like you do in Libya, right? So this idea is, nobody I think would go in and tell the Libyans, this is a great electoral rule, why don't you go for this, right? On the other hand, if you want to make sure the country doesn't break down into civil war in the process of trying to get to an election, maybe that's the electoral rule that you end up with. So I think that it creates some again, some tensions and some trade-offs that have to be thought through very carefully in terms of that. I come down on the side of thinking that getting to the first election is a very important thing to do, right? And that electoral rules, and this is something I think I need to investigate more empirically, and maybe you actually know more about, but that electoral rules, at least under the authoritarian periods, tend to be very malleable, right? I mean, Jordan has basically, in Egypt too, both of them have just about an electoral rule per election. So when you come out of thinking about it that way, then in a sense, this notion of get to the first election with the electoral rule that got people to the, to the polls and got the, sort of the elites to the table doesn't seem like such a bad idea, because it's not a sense in which you think it's going to be the electoral rule for life, right? The question, of course, is to what extent does that then become the electoral rule for life, or to how changeable is it or isn't it as you move into those periods, and is there a good way? And I'm interested to know it, but I don't know it. Is there a good way to judge what's the balance between trying to get to sort of more perfect at the outset versus the sort of what I think of as a very sort of pragmatic and probably in a sense my preferred approach, which is get somewhere.
Okay, terrific. Okay, thank you. So, so let me begin with a question, which is, so it's, one of the striking empirical claims in the memo was this question about this claim about how social networks shape electoral institutions and in particular, I was very kind of captivated by this claim about the impact of social networks on the demand for political parties, right? And so I think you make this claim that you say where political elites can count on social networks to mobilize support, they have little incentive to develop political parties. And you give these examples from Jordan and Kuwait, and they rely instead on tribes and other social networks to mobilize. Okay? But then you have in this footnote, in footnote 18, you have this. You say, well, but of course, the demand for political parties depends on other electoral institutions, such as electoral system design, right? And then Jordan presents a good case study, right? So the 93 Jordanian reforms moved from multi-member districts that had multiple votes, right, down to a single non-transferable vote system. And you say that, listen, this had a huge impact upon political party standing. The Brotherhood pretty much gets washed out, and then it kind of leaves electoral politics. So then the question is, how do you interpret that moment, right? So one way to read this is that the monarch, the standard way, the way you did in your first book, right, said that, well, listen, the monarch basically manipulated the rules here precisely to get the Brotherhood out of politics, right, because he saw them as a threat. Another way to read this is through this social network story, right? Could you say, right? So I'm just wondering, so there's an authoritarian manipulation story, and there's a social network story. And I'm just wondering, are they opposites? Can they be integrated? Because it seems to me that you don't want to lose the authoritarian manipulation aspect of that episode, right? And you could say the same thing about Kuwait, right? There's the same type of gaming, and that's what the protests are about right now. So I'm just wondering how you'd react to that.
Okay, so I actually don't think that they're as much intention as you suggest they are, right. Because here's the thing: when essentially there is a sense in which both authoritarian leaders can both manipulate or shape, I think is probably a nicer way to put it, but they can shape both the electoral rules and therefore the outcomes. They can also shape, I argue in the first book, the relationship between opposition parties. I mean, they also shaping the ways in which tribes do or don't matter. A lot of people would argue that tribes have become increasingly important since '89 in Jordan, when they've been essentially in some ways encouraged to take on this role of acting now as political parties, starting to have the kind of primary role, literally like holding primaries that they have. So in some ways, there's nothing about this pointing to the fact that social networks and that this underlying expectation of sense of obligation towards those who are within networks, that's not in odds with an idea that the authoritarian elite who are looking at this can say, this is one of the levers I can use. And in fact, what I would say happens in '93 is they know that this is one of the levers they can use, right? So, and it doesn't remove the IAF from politics, the IAF being the Muslim Brotherhood Party, right? But what it does is it certainly diminishes its representation in parliament and its strength, right? And it means that a lot of times when IAF members are getting seats, they're actually because they both have these social ties and they have the party, right? So, it continues to undermine parties. I mean, the place where you can, and I think it's hard. It's hard because, just like I've said about ruling parties, maybe sometimes being better seen as coalitions of elites who mobilize different networks, right? The same thing can be said, I think, of for example, the non-ruling parties. If you're talking about a place like Morocco, where it has party lists, a PR system that people run on lists, but essentially it still is a question of, if you're a Moroccan, and there's one of the fellows at Yale now was explaining, what you do, of course, if you want to run, is you go back to you go back and you try to mobilize the support of the people in your network in order to tell the party that this is the person that they need to run in your area, right? So I don't think those are at odds with each other, really.
Okay. So let's open it up. Who wants to start? Somebody? Steve.
So the story you tell, as you said, about parliamentary legislative elections. I'm just wondering, with respect to the extent that presidential elections, I mean, how different do you think it would be? Because just many of these facts obviously just wouldn't apply. So, what's going on in presidential elections? The second question is, in talking about the first election, I was presuming there will be a second and a third, but obviously the big danger is that this will be the one and only election, and I wonder how much that concern should play into the structure of the first election to make sure there are future elections. Just that concern. And the third is, as the transition takes place, and therefore presumably the sense that what elections are about have more policy content, how much does one expect all of these things will change? I mean, how much does one expect that the kind of exchange of vote for goods model will sort of come into play? Political parties in all the ways that you say it doesn't under the social network.
So you're absolutely right. The presidential elections, I think, are in many ways, a very different thing, right? People don't think that what's at stake is they're sort of parliamentarian. They don't think that sort of the same kind of ways social networks should play a role, I think, do. And in fact, this is one reason why I always argue that we should be really clear about if we're talking about local, national executive, or national legislative elections, that they're essentially very different animals. It's also, I think Mona El-Kabashi made this point last time, and I thought it was a very good point. One reason why some of the secular parties might be more interested in seeing sort of more strength to the executive, right? Because they have essentially kind of a better chance of doing well there. So I totally agree that they're different, and I don't think that it necessarily translates into. I mean, it doesn't mean that you can't, as a presidential candidate, try to mobilize these networks. And I know that a friend of mine worked with the Abdel Fattah campaign, and said that it was striking that how little some of the top party elites of some of the parties had, or elites had at the local level of actually controlling, right? That it was really the sort of local networks that mattered, and not national pledges of support. Now, in terms of sort of assuring that there's a future election, I agree, and essentially, right, I'm tending to sort of focus on assuring that there's a first election, right, which is one aspect and one issue. It's not clear to me, and I don't mean to be flippant about this. It's not clear to me that that we have a really good sense of what the dividing line is in terms of how much or how little a parliament can be under sort of a majority of a party before it's either perceived as too dangerous, which might have been what happened in the Egyptian case, or actually is too dangerous. And of course, at the other extreme is a question of fragmentation, right? That if you get them that are too fragmented and you can't do anything, then you also see this incredible sort of loss of confidence and stagnation. So I think you're right. It's just I'm not sure I really know what it is that would assure the future elections. I guess that's what the question is. How much change is under new democracies as they move forward? I think surprisingly little, actually. And again, this would depend a little bit on sizes of districts matters, whether or not you have sort of PR versus individual seats matters. I mean, there's a lot of institutional factors that come into play on this. But if you look at the literature on something like clientelism and clientelistic parties that's coming out of Latin America, for instance, And I think a lot of this is the same things that are happening. So I don't think that it necessarily should be an expectation that it changes quickly. And again, I think it changes more in some areas than others. I mean, people in rural areas, I would argue, and rural and poorer areas within urban areas, tended to be still thinking very much in service terms. People in the upper middle class and upper class urban areas tended to think less in those terms. So I think that this is partly also depending on what kinds of, but not just class and education, but also what kinds of networks your area is consisting of.
Okay. Jack.
So I'm interested in how your tribal network level relates to the ideologically based political parties level of what's going on in these political systems. And I would include in that not just programmatic, like socialist parties or labor parties, but also ethnic parties or sectarian parties, which are, after all, in a sense, based on an ideology. So would I be right in inferring from some of what you've already said that you see the ethnic or sectarian parties as having a kind of natural affinity with tribal network politics in the sense that most ethnic groups or most religious sects are, if you're in a tribe, everyone in that tribe is of one ethnicity or one religious sect rather than cross-cutting. And in that sense, the tribal politics sort of is the grassroots that sort of builds into the broader coalition. And, but on the other hand, I wonder if some people wouldn't say, yeah, but wait, Shia politics isn't really so much anchored on the family, it's anchored on the neighborhood mosque, which is a different kind of structure of mobilization and ideology. And then sort of the last part of this is, well, what about those labor parties? Is there some way for them to tap into family structures and the patronage dynamic that you're talking about, or are all secular and non-ethnic parties just doomed to be out of the loop in societies whose grassroots organization is this kind of family network?
Okay, so starting with the tribes question, right? Are tribes and ethnicity and sectarian sort of parties the same thing? I mean, I think, first of all, it's not exactly empirically correct to say that you never get tribes that actually have cross, for example, sectarian lines, right? But that aside, or families, it also will sometimes cross them. But that aside, I think one way to think about this is that tribes and religious networks and ethnic networks are all different types of networks. And what I try to say is that it's less important whether it is about tribe and kin, or whether it's about ethnic identity, or about even sort of religious sort of mosque networks, than it is about how much you sort of know those in your area, how much you interact with them, how sort of either single, I think of it almost like as a sort of a single relationship with them, right? You're my landlord, I'm your tenant, or is it that you're my landlord, but also my, we go to the same mosque, and we also do these. I mean, how dense are those networks in terms of multiple ties, right? That to me is much more important than, do we share an ethnic identity, or do we share a tribal identity, or do we share sort of the same mosque? So one of the things I sort of want to go back to the literature about right, is to say, okay, then when you take these differences into account, what can we say about where we get mobilization and where we don't? Right? So that's the first part. which brings me to the fact I wouldn't exactly say that mosques operate differently. And in fact, I think, one of the things very interesting to me is that mosques have many of the same kinds of operational sort of mechanisms that, the family does, right? I mean, when we're thinking of strong mosques and we're thinking of strong families, I mean, down to the language of brotherhood and sisterhood, but also up to the idea that the same person who is, you're attending worship services with is the one who's watching your kids, is the one who that you're helping out with when they're sick, and all of these different ways in which you have relationships, which are much more multiple than simply attending a service together. And that of course is the same thing with strong families, not with weak families, mine being one of them, where everybody's in a different state and we talk to each other on holidays, but with very kind of strong families, the kind that actually mobilize. Now, are Labor parties doomed? I actually don't think they are, but if they keep working the way they have been working, they probably are. Okay, so one discussion I had with a person who was a minister and came out of a Labor Party in Egypt, and I said, with all due respect, you're constantly complaining about the fact that basically that the brothers are able to use mosques and charities and all of these services to mobilize support. But there's nothing about nothing about charities and services that has to be about having a mosque attached to it, right? So, why not have soup kitchens or charities or food? I mean, do something, essentially, was what the argument was. And he said, but we're a political party. Right? So there's this notion of purity of political party that meant that you didn't want to go out and dirty your hands and do these things, which is fine. But I think that my take is in the world that you're looking at, that sort of absent those kinds of ties and those kinds of sort of local interest in a lot of these areas, you're probably not going to get much support.
Well, just continuing what you just said, I think for me, I'm wondering, following your presentation, is this a good thing or a bad thing, right? I mean, it's simplistically asking, and what I mean by that is, in democracies that we come from, we expect that parties are going to be aggregators of social interests and serve larger national goals, and not just be these atomized, each one taking care of their neighborhood and their tribe and their thing like that. And so, to me, it seems that we do want party systems to be more like the national ideological, national interest type things, that they're not looking just to serve a little community. And I'm wondering what your opinion is on that. I mean, is this phenomenon of parties being attached to local networks and local interests, sort of, is that a good thing, or is it something that we should start to change?
I think it's a natural thing, okay? And I think it's something that if you want to think about, there's party strengthening or electoral rule formation or anything that needs to be sort of recognized as before thinking about whether it's sort of good or bad, right? In addition, I think that I think if you looked at American history, we would see it here. We would see it in a lot of places. We would see it in a lot of areas that are, today, but except for just different sets of communities. So I think it's a phenomenon that's likely to break down in sort of three ways. Right. So for those who think normatively it's a bad thing, I think first of all, again, electoral rules and the sets of issues that are out there do matter, right? So you simply have to have broader issues start to come into play when you have really large districts, or when you have, essentially when you need elites to find the issues that they're going to sort of coordinate over, and also likely when more issues are really on the table that have sort of long implications. You'd be surprised, by the way, at the numbers of people when going to Tunisia for the Constituent Assembly who had no notion that Constituent Assembly was supposed to have anything to do with drafting a constitution, right? I mean, the last thing on their mind. So it asks people, does it matter to you if the person you elect actually has some understanding of law? And they would be like, why should that matter? So I think you have to be, it's both what kinds of things are actually being decided and also sort of understandings of that. But the other way this breaks down is when these networks, where they're weak, of course, that they don't actually play the same role, right? So part of this is just a question about urbanization, about mobility, and those kinds of, in a sense, processes that will undermine it over time.
I'm just going to piggyback on this question a little bit. I mean, what you said totally resonates with me, but then I wonder, because a lot lot of the literature about, again, political parties very much based on the idea of pure ideological parties, like you just said. And it seems to me that even from your telling of it, kind of the way that political mobilization is structured now, with it being very much about interpersonal relationships, is almost in a way a reaction to a lack of transparent structures, a lack of an ability to, you know, meaningfully vote on ideologies. Mm-hmm. So I was interested in your comment. You said that you didn't necessarily think that was even the best kind of setup for the United States, to have it really be about individuals, having an individual connection with candidates. I would be kind of interested to know how, you know, whether it's a good or a bad thing, how you see this changing if there end up being kind of more transparent, ideological-based democratic institutions in these countries, and then, you know, bring in what you said about the United States. Is there a happy medium, and, you know, or are these just kind of coping mechanisms in a way for dealing with autocratic rule?
No, just to be clear, I didn't say that I don't think it's the best thing. I don't think it's always that it accurately sort of represents the way that these relationships take place across the state. That's what my point is. So it's not a, you know, that I wish we would all go back to this. No. Now, I do think you're absolutely right. In fact, a long time I've argued that, you know, things that we should take into account in with much more sort of seriousness that would have an effect on electoral politics are things like, you know, merit exams and civil service exams and merit-based hiring and all sorts of things that seem like they're apart, that they're something entirely separate, but are actually connected to the kinds of things that a person starts to think that they need to have from their representative. So in a sense, the more transparency, the sort of the more rule of law, the more the sort of the bureaucratic kind of realm of the world works correctly, the less demand there is to have a representative who does all of these things for you, right? So the less you need WASTA, the more that you can actually expect that you simply go to the office and you get what needs to be done.
Yeah. What you just said kind of made me think something else, but in reading your paper, it seemed like this was kind of looked at as like a first sort of instance where, you know, things are still being sorted out and they were just going to go how they go, but there's seemed to be an implicit idea that there was a natural progression towards more of what we would recognize as like democracy and democratization, and this idea of a political leader or a legislator being more insulated from the day-to-day needs of the people. I wonder if there's room for departure from that, because we're looking at a completely different cultural context where social networks are very important, you know, and clientelism or WASTA or whatever you want to call it. Is it possible that there just might not be this natural progression, that we might have like a completely different animal where the reliance of people on their legislator for their day-to-day needs might just be sort of an accepted? Because I mean, like these instances are not the first instance that we've seen. It's like Hezbollah also kind of made its mark as first just delivering social services to people and then turning into a political organization. And I don't necessarily think that's going to go away.
It's a good question. I mean, I don't think it necessarily has to go away either, right? And here's the, I think it's more likely to go away, again, going back to the earlier question about, you know, the more transparency, the more policies are on the table, the more that you actually have other demands that need to be, and other things that are being sorted out by Parliament, and fewer sort of services that need to be offered. The sort of counterpoint to that, right, which goes along your lines, is that in some ways they are become more, and we've had this in the past with the authoritarian regimes, which I've looked at in more detail, and obviously the transitional ones are yet to be written. But the demands, sort of the interest among parliamentarians of trying to increase transparency and trying to sort of, you know, strengthen bureaucracies and trying to get rid of some of these services that they provide, of course, is diminished by people who've come into power through exactly those mechanisms, right? So, you know, that's sort of the kind of the catch-22 to this, right? Is that you can also get people who are elected on a basis that makes them very, you know, much less likely and much less interested in trying to rid themselves of some of these you know, problems. Joel Barkin has a book, and actually ran a large project that was part of a World Bank project and looked at legislatures in Africa. And in some ways, that might be the place to look for, what kinds of things were useful and which ones continue to be problems. Because of course, they face exactly the same, in many ways, the same kinds of sort of social structural issues that make people's interest in parliamentarian and those kinds of close connections still very, very strong. And they've had the problems of weak parliaments and authoritarianism. One of the arguments that came out, and maybe there's other arguments as well, but one of them that always struck me as somewhat problematic, but nevertheless they stand behind, is that having parliamentarians start to become much more, frankly, highly paid and directly sort of able to do things and accountable, or not accountable, but isolated or insulated from the executive has helped them to be able then to at least start to move towards public goods provision as opposed to selective goods provision, and that starts to sort of, kind of create the incentives that you want to see for these other changes. But that's one place to look, right? I mean, I don't think we're going to find the answers in the transitional states of the Middle East as much as we would probably in a place like Africa.
Could I ask a kind of a follow-up question to this, which is that, is there a difference between a social network and a social network that's politically mobilized? Right, so when you said that the social network is a natural thing, that cued for me the kind of constructivist primordialist debate in ethnic politics, right? And so constructivists would say that we create these ethnicities and we also mobilize them, right? So maybe you want to draw a distinction between the social network that exists, so it's not created, but there's a difference between that and one that's mobilized, right? So there's a path dependency to this. Right, so it's not so much that the network suddenly chooses an electoral system or shapes the demand for a party system. A network is mobilized, maybe perhaps by electoral rule manipulation, like in Jordan in '93. And once it's mobilized, then that shapes electoral system choice going forward. So I'm wondering how you think about that.
It's a good question. I mean, it is true that there's places where you have competing networks, right? And one of the questions, but I think of it more along the lines of kind of individual elites, which ones, or how can they mobilize or attempt to mobilize more than one network, right?
Yeah.
And again, it's still a sort of an elite's choice. I mean, this is very much along sort of also, Posner has this notion of elites going out and mobilizing.
Exactly.
And I entirely sort of buy the constructivist notion that networks themselves actually can be shaped and changed and rewritten, right? And in fact, there's some really nice work that's done on looking at Lebanese and Jordanian tribes and how they sort of are rewriting who's even part of the tribe or who's not part of the tribes in Jordan and groups in Lebanon. But that said, I mean, I still think. How to put it, that at any one point in time, it's not going to be terribly satisfactory, but at any one point in time, I still think that there's only a certain number of networks that individuals see themselves as really sort of being engaged in and being able to use politically. And I think when elites are saying, what kind of electoral rule do I want to have, right? Yeah. Whether they're actually at the table and able to write that, they're closer to the tribes in Jordan, or if they're not and all they're doing is able to do a sort of boycott like the IAF in Jordan, they still are thinking through the question of, what are the sets of groups I can mobilize, and what does that mean is the rule that I prefer. So in a sense, I think there's a temporal issue here, right?
Right.
At any one point in time, what your potential groups are.
I mean, what motivated the question is whether you can unwind these things, right? So once the network gets activated as kind of a basis for mobilization, can you kind of turn it back, or is it a one-way kind of process? Because so for example, imagine a counterfactual with Jordan. Let's say we went back to the pre-93 electoral system. What would happen? Right. Oh. Okay. So would you have more space? Because the point of the '93 change was to kind of diminish the political space for ideologically oriented parties, right? Particularly the Brotherhood, right? So so then the networks get activated, okay, and you get a certain type of service MP elected. So what would happen now if we were to kind of unwind and go back to pre-93? Would the network, now that it's activated, kind of, in a sense, dominate electoral politics, and the ideological parties just wouldn't be able to get going again?
Okay. So I don't think that there's a difference between the idea that the networks weren't activated before 93 and the idea that they weren't winning before 93.
Okay.
So they were activated,
Right.
right? So the idea before 93 was you know, this is the
Right.
sort of way everybody says it, you cast
Right.
one vote for your
Right.
ideology, you cast one vote for your tribe. The only difference was that when you had to choose between casting now only one vote and it was
Right.
going to be tribe or ideology, you cast that vote for the tribe, right?
Right.
So it meant,
Right.
but it didn't mean that tribe didn't
Got it.
trump it before, right?
Got it.
So.
Got it.
But that's a different, you know, the second part of the question is, can we imagine that these networks become less important in mobilizing, right?
Yeah.
And can they be, you know, can that change? And that goes back to my earlier points that I think there's a lot of structural changes, right? Everything from demographic changes and mobilization to some institutional changes that can actually make these less, you know, less the way to be able to win, right? And less mobilized. But I don't think that it's about I don't think it's necessarily fast.
Okay. Okay.
I'm curious about, in your mind, what the connection is between service MPs and clientelism in general and corruption in the Middle East. Probably because I imagine that to the one being held, this notion of service MPs is a good thing, but based on what I've read and some of the people I've spoken to in the Middle East, it seems like when they talk about governments being corrupt, a lot of times it kind of bleeds over into this same area with the fact that, oh, MPs will just, or parliamentary members will just help the ones they know. And I know it also occurs with judges. For example, ruling in the favor of someone merely because their children go to the same school and they know each other outside of the court. So in my mind, that's why this would not be a good thing. But I mean, what is your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think your the distinction between corruption and service MPs, right, is on one hand, you know, a question of, is it that you're now ruling in a favor of the person who really should have lost, but it's, you know, but you're letting them win, right? Or you know, and I think that certainly sometimes the helping of your client down to the fact that your client, your sort of person in your network, down to the fact that that person can be yourself, right? When it, you know, often goes beyond sort of the law and obviously is corrupt, right? So, you know, making sure that the cement factory, sort of the tender comes to your company is, I think, going into the land of corruption when there's other sort of better bids out there, right? In other cases, it's not necessarily clear that, you know, calling up the person in the office to say, hey, by the way, make sure that this person's, that you've paid attention to their application for a license, really is corruption. I mean, maybe it could be seen, it certainly has a flavor of favoritism to it, but it doesn't mean that they're going to get a license that they shouldn't have otherwise gotten. It doesn't mean that they're going to get something that shouldn't be there. It just means that the extent to which you need to have somebody who can actually sort of put the paper on the desk of the person and get something to happen, right, takes more than what it should, right? So that, again, gets back to this you know, essentially kind of the failure of bureaucracy. And this question is much more than I think it does about necessarily being corruption. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily an ideal system. Maybe it sounds like I think it is. That's not my point. Again, it is a point to say that this is sort of, I think, a reality that needs to be recognized when we're thinking about things like, okay, you know, what are the pressures out there for, you know, for electoral laws, or what are the pressures out there for political parties, or what do we expect out of the kind of the challenges sort of moving forward. By the way, I'm also not on the side that says it's absolutely a horrible thing either. I'm a bit ambivalent about it, right? Because I think sometimes we imagine that you need to get to a world where, you know, personal relations mean nothing, and I'm not sure I'm there either. So.
Okay.
Thank you. And I wonder if beyond the impact on electoral dynamics, we can see broader implications for institutional design, especially legislative executive relations and centralization, decentralization, how that would play, you know, into the broader picture. And a point related to this one is on the creation of constitution-making bodies. So at first, we saw the decision of the Amendments Committee in Egypt to have a second-degree election as something that was bad, right? But do you think that somehow took into consideration these dynamics of representation that you address, whereas the Tunisian decided to go on the first degree? I mean, so institutional design both in the constitution to be, but also
In
on the drafting body.
process.
Yeah.
Okay, so frankly, I just wish I knew the answer. I don't. I really don't. I mean, it's an intriguing idea, right? That this is sort of being recognized, and it's a problem that's being in whichever way and whatever decision makers, right, being avoided. And I honestly don't know, but I'll think about that more. I do think it definitely plays sort of a role in arguments about decentralization, right? And of course, also in arguments about federalism, right, which is what you're hearing a lot of in the Libyan case, right? And so, obviously stronger polls for that in places where these kinds of groups exist and see themselves as somehow being distinct and needing to sort of have their say. And executive legislative relations, again, those sort of the only thing I could sort of think of or thought of, and this is only really because Mona sort of drew it to my attention, was the extent to which these different networks and the different abilities to play them have meant that there's different demands for that balance, right? Which I think is very intriguing, actually. So the answer, I think there's lots of broader implications, but I haven't stopped for the moment.
Chris?
Looking at the possible virtues of the more system in which a representative is more accountable to these local networks. One virtue is that it empowers citizens to be able to assess whether someone is effectively doing their job or not. So there's an empowerment of citizenship in a way. And one way to counteract that is to make things very centralized and bureaucratic such that there is no ability for this sort of particularizing logic to determine when a good is being distributed. And there's a Democratic theorist, Pierre Rosanello, who's written a book about the rise of an impartial, professionalized bureaucracy and how important it was for the development of democracy in France and the United States. But with that drops out some of these empowered citizen able to really assess this. Are there other routes to get that empowered citizen capable of really holding to account and knowing what the representative is doing in a way that gets us out of the divisive situation that you're describing?
So one of the things I think is really interesting is a project that's been done in Lebanon, right? So the idea, I think the notion of getting out of this, of course, requires a sense on the citizens' part that they want to get out of this, right? That somehow, and I try to sort of mention this in the paper, I think it's not simply the fact that I expect that you'll respond to me more quickly, right? That's part of it. But there's also a clear sort of social obligation to, continuing to support the members of your group. I mean, so there's two parts to this, right? So there's an idea where, and it depends on, it sort of varies across who you're talking to, but there's a sense in which, you don't really need to know what the sort of the local candidate's thinking or doing because that's your local candidate, and of course that's who you're supposed to respond. So I think we have to remember that that's part of the equation, part of what's going into it. So in Lebanon, there's been a push by a man named Choudhry, who I think is fantastic, and he and others had started a project where they started to say to people, fine, vote for your sect. We know you want to vote for your sect, that's fine. But you should at least know what they're doing once they're in parliament, right? So there's a push to saying, you still need to know what they're voting on. You still need to know what they're actually doing, and to making this publicly available, sort of essentially through the internet. So another project's being done in Tunisia that's very similar to this, not with the same "we know you're going to vote for your sect." It wouldn't be something you would say in Tunisia, but a notion of trying to inculcate a sense of accountability, even for those who are from your group. And I think that's a really useful way to think about it, right? So they don't actually have to be incompatible. So if you want to choose from a small set, fine, but still make sure that that person from your small set is actually doing something.
Jack.
So we're accustomed from modernization theory to thinking of societies as either being traditional, where everything works based on personal relationships, or modern, where everything works on law and contract. But you're describing societies where there's some of both going on simultaneously. And some people would say that's the worst of both worlds, because the principles of organization of society and economy and the political system are internally contradictory, which leads to conflict and also leads to all sorts of opportunities for rent-seeking, and that drives down productivity, politicizes identities in divisive ways, and that you really want to get through that middle place that as fast as possible. You want, your political program should be revolutionary transformation of society so that it gets through that nasty bad place in the middle as quickly as possible. But a lot of what you've been saying sounds like no, that actually there's some way to organize society, politics, and the economy that's at a kind of tolerable, middling equilibrium, even though it's not either tradition nor modern. And if that's what you're arguing, could you sort of kind of tell us more about the architecture of how that's possible to be these opposite things at the same time and have it work?
Thanks for an easy question.
I really like that.
First of all, I'm not sure I agree with the premise. I'm not sure that I agree with the notion that we go from traditional to modern, or that we've achieved modern, okay? I think what may make more sense to think of that, because I mean, why is it that we know this, right? It matters if you're a Yale employer hiring somebody and it comes through that they got a Yale PhD, I'm sorry, or an NYU employer hiring an NYU. That somehow that person somehow looks better than others. I'm sorry, but I think that there's still a reality there, right? And that has nothing to do with anything that we think of in our sort of, kind of clearly sort of modern meritocratic world, unless you want to make an argument that they're always better, right? And I think that's problematic. So that's, I mean, I don't know that we've really gone from traditional to modern, but one way to think about it was we may have various mixes, right? And those mixes may come into play in to different degrees in different realms of society. So I'm half agreeing with your premise, but not fully. Then how do we, I mean, I'm not so sure I agree that we need to sort of rush through it, right? Because that also suggests this, that we then accept the second part, which is that somehow the modern, rule-bound sort of world is necessarily a better one than either the traditional or then whatever this middle mix is. And again, my point is, I don't actually have a great answer for like how you then organize it and the sort of what this world should ideally look like. But my point is, there are things that get lost in the move to, sort of the, kind of modern rule-bound sort of modern world, and particularly when we don't really achieve that, and what we achieve is somewhere in between, but we're not willing to recognize it. Right? Then I think we really are losing something. So this is not an entire answer. It's essentially you're pushing me to sort of really think about what this world looks like and what these trade-offs are, and I haven't quite got there.
I'm just wondering what campaigns tend to look like in this context. Insofar as there needs to be a runoff between different members kind of the same social group, what does that tend to be decided on? Is it who makes the most personal promises? Is it charisma? Is it who can work the system the best? And just kind of building from there, what implications does this have for campaign finance?
So what campaigns tend to look like? Again, this depends a little bit on the areas, right? So what you're sort of in a sense sort of focusing on are the areas where these networks are strong, right? And And there, what they often look like is that, you know, the emphasis is on so-and-so is the son of such and such, or is supported by this tribe, or is being, you know, given the sort of the support of these, you know, these prominent people in the area, okay? In some cases, it's formalized, right? And I think one of the very interesting things is the extent to which not only that you get primaries, literally come, hand in your identity card, take your ballot, vote, pick up your identity card, sort of primaries in some of the tribes, but you also get, you know, the same kinds of accusations of ballot box stuffing and corruption that go on with them. So in a sense, the primary then looks like an election, right? And what people are voting on or basing it on is your usual things, you know, how much I know you versus somebody else, how much I think that you're actually a good person. I mean, I'm not saying that the only thing people care about is whether or not they know somebody, right? They also care about whether or not they think they're competent, they think that they're generally a good person, if they've helped them in the past, those kinds of things matter. And what the district election tends to look like, right, is one where often it's not that you have 10 candidates necessarily from your village, but you have, you know, a candidate from your village, they have a candidate from their village, and really what you're looking at is that the majority of the votes for a candidate come from the village that they're the son of. If we've got some evidence on this in the Egyptian case especially, and sort of it's essentially, I would think of it as sort of competing networks. And more than, and again, there's the choice of the candidate, and that a lot of times is being done by going around and talking to people, trying to build up support, getting sort of consensus around the idea that you're the candidate we should have as opposed to another. That again, especially talking now about areas where you have these really sort of strong social networks, where you don't, under authoritarianism often meant that nobody was running, or if it was just a kind of a political entrepreneur who was running with a political party, et cetera.
So the idea we're talking about is essentially that after this first round of elections post-revolution, what we're seeing is voter behavior isn't changing as much as we might have expected in terms of who you choose. What I'm wondering is, to the extent that voter behavior is determined by believing the person you vote for can help you personally, how much will it matter if those networks of service provision change when new groups come into power? If you can't rely on somebody to get you a job because they don't have the same ties they used to have anymore, it's just they can't pull the same strings. Will people just shift to someone they think can do it, or will people start looking more towards platform-based parties?
So, two things. I want to clarify what things do and don't change. Okay, there's always a set of people for whom it's not interesting, or the elections didn't matter as service provision. In a place like Egypt, they were quite, you know, the vast majority of people, about it was like 20% turnout in the Egyptian case, right? Arguably about 50% turnout, although a lot of people would say more like 35 in the Jordanian case. So you have a whole set of voters who weren't voting before, many of whom entered the elections. And those are not people who are voting on, I want a service representative. Those are people often voting on, sometimes it's not, but often they're voting on, I want somebody who can deliver a policy. So there is a change, there is a shift, and I think it's important to keep that in mind because it answers some of these other questions as well. But the issue is, for those who do care still about services, right, there's two things. One is, yes, before they had a really clear idea that this was the person who could deliver, right? And so this concern about whether or not the Flula would be actually able to do well, right, was an idea that these were the people who were close to the old regime, they had done well in the past, and essentially sort of the idea was they had the resources and they should be able to do well. People will tell you in many cases someone from their network would still ran in the elections. They didn't do well. They were no longer seen as the one person who could actually be close to the regime. So people don't, especially in the transitional period, they really don't know who actually has the ability to do something, right? The only thing I think that they're really sort of left with is knowing that they have a tie with somebody. So that part matters. I mean, what we see in the Egyptian case is that two things. One is that the areas where Noor did the best, right, are also exactly the same areas where it used to be that the old NDP did the best. organized, right? I mean, old entity did well everywhere, but this is where they actually were able to mobilize people and get them out. And my argument is, and actually, the second fact I think that's important to know is that if you look at new entrants versus old entrants, yes, never kids do, but it's important that there's no differences in the distribution of who they vote for, right? So what that meant was you had these areas where people were being mobilized by networks and essentially sort of with an idea that going out to vote would help them in the future. It's kind of old clientelistic politics. So what did they do now? They didn't necessarily know. I mean, Noor certainly wouldn't have been your notion of a pick for who would have done well in the future. But this was the sort of the network of personal relations that were able to mobilize.
So a question about other parts of the world and whether you see something like this happening. If you think back to Bismarck in Germany or Napoleon in France and maybe Ataturk in Turkey, there were strong executives who, because of their charisma, were able to promote a shift in allegiance from the local. And really got a move away from, if you think about Germany, it was a bunch of tribes, right? And this is a real shift that was accomplished at the highest level because it was an executive that could evoke a certain leadership and a certain care, I'm wondering if you think, sort of looking down the road, whether there'll be that kind of interaction and whether there are, I don't know, say great modernists coming down the pike that would promote that kind of shift.
I don't know if there's great modernists coming down the pike. It is, in some ways, I think there were great modernists who came down the pike. Yeah. So I want to sort of distinguish between this idea of kind of nationalism at a sort of a broad level, and still the importance of some of these networks at the local level. So, a great example is Bourguiba, and then following Ben Ali in Tunisia, right? So in those cases, it became very clear that you really sort of focused and that legitimate identity was a national Tunisian Arab identity, essentially, okay? And that local identities and tribes were not legitimate, right? So that very much along the lines of an Ataturk, sort of, in fact, Bourguiba and Ataturk are really very closely parallels. So the interesting thing that happens in Tunisia post-revolution, right, is that you start to realize that these identities never really faded away, and that these networks were not unimportant. In other words, they were important during this period. So we've seen that with conflicts that become even violent between basically between clans and other groups in Tunisia. I found it, and I thought this was very interesting. I wanted to ask a question in a survey that said, did you ever go to a parliamentarian to ask for help, right? And then the follow-up question was going to be, why did you choose that parliamentarian? Because you knew them personally, because of X, Y, and Z. And then we were going to ask on we did ask those questions, by the way. We were going to ask on the local level, did you ever turn to a local council member for help, okay? And then why did you turn to the local council member? Same set of answers. We got vetoed. Inconsistently, people say, you cannot ask that question, you cannot ask that question. I mean, it seems like a very innocuous question, at least to me. It's told the reason you can't ask that question, people will answer it for the MP because it really didn't matter and they didn't really go to the MP, right? But if you ask for the local member, right, people went to the local member because they were the person who was in their family, who was somebody they knew. And the answers that we were getting from the people we were working with, you either won't get real answers because people won't admit that that's why they went to see them, right? Or you'll get people upset. But there was a clear sense that those networks still mattered, but they had become essentially kind of delegitimized by the Bourguiba kind of nationalism that was essentially kind of widespread. But it didn't undermine them really. So I think there's an interest. I mean that's the same question it could be asked, with sort of, for example, with Turkey, right? But there's interesting ways in which, and especially it varies across space and time, right? But it didn't mean that the modernizer really changed the underlying mechanisms of relationships.
In the Brookings piece we also read, you talk a lot about how the international community can assist in elections. And I'm wondering, with this argument here, what would you add on to that, knowing that social networks play the role that they do? How should any NDI, State Department, engage to promote political parties or?
So it means a couple of things. One of which is that, in the Brookings piece, I sort of suggest that you really shouldn't do much with party strengthening. It's a little awkward, by the way, actually do a party strengthening project, but that's fine.
Yeah.
But the reason, of course, and here I'm really focusing on these first elections is partly because you are going to get all these candidates, and I know somebody here didn't particularly like this argument, but basically, over time you'll start to see, I think, some of the winnowing of those, and that's assuming a lot of other changes take place. So one of the things I would tell sort of the people who work on the party strengthening, right, is that you want to understand. One of the things that they try to do is to get people to sort of develop party platforms and think about how to campaign and how to sort of go out and get their message across. And there tends to be a really sort of strong emphasis on things like advertising, websites, a strong emphasis on, clear political messages. I don't think that that's unimportant, but I certainly think that where it's important varies, and that there are places where it's less important, there's places where it's more important, and that they should also be getting that message across to the party members who are interested in this. Sometimes they seem a bit dismissive of that. So one woman told me at one point, somebody came in, he said he wanted to be running in the elections, and that, and I said, how are you getting your message across? And he said, I'm the mailman, and I go and I talk to everybody every day, and I tell them I want to run, and I'm going to do a good job, and I care about our roads, and I care about our water. And she literally laughed. I mean, she thought this was the most hilarious notion of how you would run in a campaign. And I said, that might be true, but doesn't it depend on where he is, right? I mean, aren't there places where that beats your website, right? So I think that one of the things you would tell, kind of the NDI and IRI and others is, be really clear about how these elections actually work when you're deciding what you think is sort of the right, kind of the right strategies forward. And similarly, I mean, so the project I do, which I don't think is as bad a project, of course, but that's because I do it, is aimed at getting people to understand why it is, both where their support is and where they don't have support, right? And doing advice for parties, but also what it is that people run on in these different areas and what kinds of strategies matter. Which, frankly, I think sometimes they understand more than those who are giving the advice.
So, in some countries that we call advanced democracies, the party structure is not really ideological parties, but they're kind of catch-all parties, where the base of the party are interest groups or, in some cases, local clientelistic or client service operations, like the LDP in Japan, or the Democratic Party back in the days when it was a coalition of labor union people in the North, advocates of Jim Crow in the South, and a bunch of other internally contradictory interest factions. So I'm wondering, based on that kind of a notion, whether you think it's possible to build up a catch-all party in an Arab country where the base of it would be some kind of face-to-face clientelistic, tribal or identity group structure of various kinds, but where to win national elections, a coalition of these would come together and would necessarily have to have something of a national program, in order to govern if they won, rather than just doling out, or in addition to doling out pork to their constituencies. Have there been attempts like that, and what happens to them?
I think there's just attempts, and I think they've succeeded, right? So, I mean, I put Noor in that category. It'd be interesting if you agree with that. I would put I think you could arguably put the FJP, the sort of Muslim Brotherhood's Egyptian party, in that category. I think you could put Sibsi as starting a party in Tunisia. Very much fits the same sort of mold. I mean, in a sense, you're absolutely right. The way that you're going to get, the way that parties at a national level develop, right, is going to be sort of by having local level, basic sort of local level networks and branches. This gets back to my frustration earlier with the question about can labor, can the left, and secularists do the same thing, and I think obviously that they can. One of the issues is I think that they've had a harder time in many cases having the kinds of roots, especially in kind of rural and outlying areas that they need to have. Sibsi will be an exception to that in the Tunisian case.
They're all asleep. No, they're all asleep. So maybe I'll just ask another question along those lines. So I'm wondering to what extent this type of argument cuts on the question of whether to have a directly elected head of state. Okay, and so if you want to diminish the role of social networks and encourage the formation of national policy platforms, so to what extent does that drive you towards having a directly elected president? And trying to take politics out of parliament, right? So does it force one to kind of, does it kind of force an elevation, as it were, or a delocalization, or diminishment of that type of the importance of the social network, assuming that's somehow local?
It may. I mean, the counter. You're like you're always hedging. The counter is this notion about can this actually instead really just be a coalition of those who support who support the sort of the candidate for presidency. I'm sort of also interested in the premise that you necessarily want to diminish the importance of the local networks, right?
Yeah.
And again, I'm not glorifying them. I'm simply saying they exist. They should be recognized. But I'm also not so sure that they're more of a problem than a lot of other, sort of problems out there. And the part, I guess, maybe what I came down on, although my answer to Jack suggests I haven't thought clearly enough about, is rather than pushing against them, is there ways to work with them for good governance?
Well, I think the question is, are they crowding out certain types of political preferences you want voters to have, right? So if you look at Figure 4, right? So what do voters want? They want services, right? So they want private goods, they want public goods, right? They want public works, they want legislation, okay? And so under authoritarian regimes, in the previous figure, the preference for legislation is pretty small, right? Now what's interesting is that if you look at Figure 4, what I did is I added up the preference for private goods and public goods as being about, kind of being a basket of, putting it, and what's interesting is that those total 60% across all categories, right, of social density. And so the question is that, if that's what politics becomes about, right, then what's left, right? And so are you, so it's about crowding out other types of considerations. It's not about excluding the role of the service MP, but about putting it in its context and place and giving it some sense of proportionality relative to other issues which can't be reduced just to local services and local public works, right? That's the concern, I think, right? And so the question is, if these networks exist, how do you manage them through institutional design so that they don't crowd out the other types of politics that, quite frankly, might have given rise to the revolutions, right? The revolutions weren't just about there isn't a road, right? I didn't get in the hospital. It's about there's no opportunity, credit is politicized, the economy is not growing, right? So, okay.
So you're absolutely right. And maybe what would be an interesting sort of there's two opportunities or two possibilities. One is that over time, these things get changed because people realize that the parliament can do more, right?
Right.
And they realize that getting your local sort of services is not the way to get the national economy sort of moving in a way that will create more opportunity, right? And so then those debates start to take place. And those debates actually didn't take place.
Yeah.
It's really strikingly absent in Tunisia and in Egypt, and the extent to which they didn't.
It's shocking. Yeah.
So you obviously one option is that that's just a learning curve issue,
Right.
and you're talking about something that changes over time. And one way to see it, and I haven't done this, right, would be to look at places where time has passed, right? And we know clientelism still clearly exists. I mean, sort of take a look at at something like Latin America and see if where you have strong social networks and weaker ones, we still have the same thing, or is it very different? So is social networks the problem, or is it simply that time and an expectation about what the role of this should be and the kinds of debate? I mean, the only thing, and I mentioned this in the paper, but the only thing that there's sort of real clarity over is where candidates stand with regards to religion.
Right.
No clarity with where they stand with regards to the economy, or with regards to foreign policy, or with regards to sort of the sort of speed of reform.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
I'm wondering if this is an issue of, because, I mean, we talked about how sort of the U.S. has the same phenomenon, but we just kind of look to our legislators to work that into legislation, not on like a one-to-one basis, not my legislator will get me into a hospital, or my legislator will get me a job, but rather my legislator will help enact legislation that will, more broadly deliver people access. And I think where it becomes kind of cyclical. It's like a chicken and egg thing where it's like, well, the legislators, in order to be elected, don't have to say that they're going to provide roads, or say they just have to, deliver these services to their constituency on a one-to-one basis. And if the constituency isn't even aware or isn't looking at them to enact legislation, then they're not going to demand that of them. So where if an international actor or whomever wanted to sort of insert an incentive to move this from the sort of micro level to the macro level, like where do you start? Do you start with politicians? Do you start with shaping the way people view their legislators?
One place to start might be with the question of sort of really just strengthening parliaments, right? I mean, so you start with also making sure that the parliaments, when people are in, can actually do what they can make these kinds of policies, and you are looking at parliaments where there's still committees are very new, and in places like Libya where they really never had parliaments, I mean, or legislatures. I mean, you're really looking at an absence of support staff and sort of the ability to even draft legislation and really get it passed. Now the GNC is being publicized every day. Okay, so and you can go to Libya, probably watch it if you're outside Libya as well. But you can watch sort of the legislature and the GNC and see what they're up to. And most of the seats are empty, right? And there's about something like half to 2/3 of them are empty, and the rest who are there are sort of kind of bumbling around. I mean, it hasn't done much for inculcating a sense among the population that the legislature is a good thing, right? But what you want to do is both on that side get I think the television, people are debating whether it was a good thing or a bad thing that it was televised, right? So it's a good thing that people are seeing that nothing's really happening, or is it a bad thing that people are seeing? Because, in a sense, it can be a good thing if all of a sudden you can get people to demand, you guys need to do something, and if you can get the kind of the resources into the legislature that actually allow it to start to do something. But that might be a slightly different starting place than either trying to get, the parties and the candidates to do something differently, or the voters. I mean, the other way to think about it is that you can also get candidates, and you can start to have a encouragement of bringing these policies into the debate, right? So, I mean, it can be that people start to talk about, what kind of an economic policy should be moving forward, right? And start to, and there certainly is a demand for debating the question of whether or not everybody should always be on strike, right? I mean, the way that the people are making demands for economic change tends to be holding strikes, everything from hunger strikes to strikes, and people are mostly seeing this as incredibly sort of, kind of a pain, right? There's obvious sort of incentives for those who are holding seats in government to basically kind of dole out the goods in the hopes that they sort of gets them reelected. There's other people who disagree with that. I mean, in that sense, it's a mess, right? But that creates a space for the debate about what really should be economic policies, and that would be another way to try to get that to actually be in.
Stephen?
Actually, I have a thought in response to your argument about presidential.
Yeah.
Because you know, and this actually ties to what you were saying. I mean, you could argue that in presidential systems, what you have in legislatures is kind of this writ large, right? Everyone's power politics.
Right.
One of my representatives I'm for me, whereas in a parliamentary system, where the fundamental function of the parliament is not to either on an individual or a statewide level engage in all power politics, but is to control the government. But that might push the more sort of policy-making function. So I mean, I think it could possibly cut either way, which goes back to my first question about presidential elections and whether people think differently. But I had another question, totally different, which was your discussion about the very high turnover rates. I was surprised about the high turnover rates because, again, you'd assume that people are voting their social networks are pretty stable, right? And therefore it would mean there would be a low turnover rate. So I was curious as to what explains that, because who else are you voting for? In turning somebody out, who are you voting for if voting is done on social network lines? So I was curious.
Okay, so again, to recognize that there are two things. One is that, and I think the biggest issue is that you have large numbers of candidates per seat, right? So, approximately 10 candidates per seat. You have often a very close sort of a close margin between those who are the last winner and the first loser. And so you're looking at places where people, and you have a lot of wasted votes. 60, 70% wasted votes. Really, really small margins in having lost and won. So people can simply think, they're going to have more people sick this time than I had last time, and it's going to be sort of a different race. So that was one reason why it happens. Another reason why you get this turnover is because there's some of these are people who are within the social networks. There's also there's some of these are swing voters who get bought. There's some people who are out there who this time they've decided their family's supporting you, and next time they decide they're going to support somebody else. So it's not that the social networks only map onto one to candidates. The third thing is that people tend to get very frustrated. It's much easier to believe that if somebody gets into the office and he's somehow from your group, that he's going to or she is going to do what you need. The reality is that there's many more demands than there is ability to actually meet all of the demands. And so most people get very frustrated with their representatives. They all feel like, I thought that this representative was going to help me and hasn't. And so the discontent with sort of representatives is actually also very high.
This was touched on briefly before, but I'm curious about how many of these issues could be solved by just better voter education. So informing voters more about the realities of government, the realities of what legislators can or cannot accomplish.
No, I think that's absolutely correct. In fact, it's amazing to me. I mean, just a couple of anecdotes, and that I think sort of show the lack of voter education, or the lack of forget just the sort of the going to the polls, right? But so one was sort of a old woman. We were asking if they're going to vote in the presidential election. And I think I told you this, but when are they going to vote in the presidential election? And they really looked at us like we were just crazy, right? So I was with a sort of a woman who was from the local popular committee. And she said, no, Choudhry, really, you're able to vote in the upcoming presidential election. And sort of, the SCAF decides that. The SCAF was still there, right? The SCAF decides that. And it was really interesting because as much as the woman I was with was trying to convince her it was a possibility, the old lady was just looking at her. She was like the most pathetic person in the world. You poor dear, you just don't understand, right? So there was that sense, right? Another woman said to us, said, did you vote in the sort of Majlis Shab? Yes, I voted in the Majlis Shab. Did you vote in the Shura? No, why not? And it said, I'd already voted. Right? So I think there's a lot to be done with even just the sort of the notion of what's taking place, let alone what's really at stake. That's true.
Can I maybe ask one last question, and it sort of takes you in a bit of a different direction. But in your paper, you referred to some interview material about public attitudes towards constitutional processes, and I think you used the phrase that these are beyond the imagination and interest of most people. And so I was very interested in that because and so what this sense and the reason it's interesting is that, of course, for internationals, right, there's this real push towards democratic constitution building, right? You have to have an inclusive process at every stage, okay? You have to have, public consultations to define what people want to do. Then you have to basically have an elected CA, and then the CA's hearings have to be in public, has to release a draft text, there have to be more hearings, so on and so on and so forth, and we even have a referendum at the end, right? That's one model that gets pushed a lot in these contexts. But then you have a kind of juxtaposed against that framework, this reality, which I'm assuming is underpinned by the same sort of social networks, right, that create a certain type of parliamentary politics. So, because the focus is really on services, right, what you can get, right, as these very concrete issues, right, as opposed as So let us say the policies that once removed from that, and what is a constitutional order? What should it look like? That's really distant, right? So if that's true, then what does that say for constitution building and its structure, right? That is so what do you do, right? Because there's a need for new constitutional frameworks in these transitional states. You just jettison public engagement. Let me just put that back to you.
It seems to me though that it's not an argument for jettisoning public engagement. It's an argument for understanding that what you're going to get is mostly elite engagement on these issues.
Right.
Right. I mean, don't expect that your average Ahmed is going to come in and have an opinion on this, but recognize that doesn't mean that it shouldn't actually be an open, engaged process that recognizes that draws in sort of comments.
Okay. On that note, please join me in thanking Ellen Lust.